So what I want to tell you about, this is actually this idea that I learned, I don't know, a million years ago from my mom when I was like, maybe Spencer's age. And she told me one time about this feeling, this feeling that she get. She identified grace, God's grace, as a feeling. And it's almost like it's not really like an emotion. It's more like an experience, I guess.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Well, and so I wanted to describe it to you, and she also said there's like these like implications.
Well,
I'm trying to find people, and it's not working.
Well, we have two in here now, and real quick, now that we're talking about this, it makes me think it may be worth it to get your writing up, just to kind of make concise what we kind of pull out and unpack out of grace, if that sounds okay. What do you think?
If you like, yeah, for sure. Let me share my screen. I'll show you the things that I was starting to do.
And basically, yeah. I was gonna say about grace, like, isn't grace like about like delicacy almost? Like, isn't
that's one way, sure.
When you're talking about grace, don't you mean like with like say like the feeling of having it unlocked, the feeling of like it's graceful if a diver dives in the right form. It's graceful is about like
if you're talking about physical grace, yeah, absolutely. You're talking about like athletic grace, but God's grace is actually quite a bit more abstract.
Oh, so you're talking about some sort of
the kind of grace you're talking about is like this
beauty.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean.
Like this, this momentary perfection.
And like there's some elegance.
Now, and that's critical, actually. Let me hit on or if it's okay, because I think that's a good point, Spence. When we visualize what we describe to be grace in the world, it is a moment of this intersectional period that is almost perfection between human and nature. It's the diver who perfects this graceful. It's the bird that gracefully goes and gets the fish out of the water. So what we identify in the world as grace is this perfect, beautiful intersection between living and the universe. So I think that's a pretty cool.
You're getting a bit. My religion is spiritual for me.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing, is that grace is well, that's the thing. When we see plants in nature, when we see animals doing their flying or their swimming, and there's a certain pattern to it that they have some command over that we can only imagine trying to understand.
Well, and there's go ahead. I'm sorry.
Like the feeling of not quite understanding, but like the feeling of the thing that's like the thing with the thing about the physicist at work. Like it's a beautiful abstract language that you can't understand but can still appreciate.
Yeah, to a certain extent, but let me offer a different kind of, or actually kind of an extension off of that, which is this.
Is there a type of mystery to it?
Well, yeah, and I think that's what this will hit on here is that mystery. So I think we have the same internalized response from our sensories and everything going on inside from what we identify grace in a moment of what you're describing versus a moment where we grant grace or receive grace in an abstract moment between relationship. And I actually think we have the same thing going on biologically inside of us when we observe something that we call graceful, and then we receive or give something that is also grace. And I'll describe what I think grace is here in a moment. And but
you are graceful yourself.
What's that?
Like when you're graceful yourself.
Yeah, correct. So like when you're graceful, you feel almost like this release of something, right? And like this moment of, it's different for everyone, but you feel internally a feeling that's hard to describe. It's this graceful feeling. And the only other time you can describe it is when you see something that's like this beautiful intersection between the living and the universe. You know what I mean? Like the diver you described.
Let me write that down because I have something up that I'm going to show you. You said a beautiful intersection. Say it again. Intersection between life and the universe?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll save that.
But I'm sorry. I was just gonna say, like a while ago, I was skateboarding, and then there was like this thing where I was doing the trick right. I was trying to get, but my foot was too far back, and he's like, "Hey man, you should put your foot forward." And then I just nailed it like 5 times in a row.
Yeah, that's a great description.
It was like a feeling.
So
like a feeling that comes.
perfect. That's perfect. Let me.
I feel like we figured it out.
Exactly. Let me offer another one that's exactly like that.
Done that kind of thing before, or have done it consistently before. It's still like a feeling of figuring it out.
Exactly.
It's about figuring out the intricacy and there's another name for that deep the deepness of understanding the system.
And let me offer one more piece to that. Once you do land it correctly, that perfectly gracious way, it's like hitting the baseball on the sweet spot of the bat when you hit a home run, where you hit it so well that you don't even feel the ball hit the bat and it's out of the park. It's the same thing. When you hit it once, you know every time when you hit the sweet spot and when you don't. When you hit your trick, you know every time when you hit your trick and when you don't. And when you hit grace, you know every time when you hit grace and when you don't.
Now you're reminding me of like the year or so I spent thinking I was doing the trick right, but I wasn't. And then when I actually got it, now whenever I mess it up, I'm like, holy crap.
You know it every time.
Like when you let go of the basketball and you know it's going to go in before it goes in.
Yeah, absolutely. Unless you're Nick Young.
Like,
yeah.
You start right
like,
before it goes.
Like, yeah, I've seen guys just like the feeling of like I've been trying to master this fighting game on my phone. It's the best phone fighting game. Footsies, play it. It's good. There's like this thing where once you have your strategy, you no longer have to think about your strategy unless you're doing something different. Once you have your idea, once you have your thing, once you've nailed it.
You're talking about the way that the learning becomes unconscious when you really have a command.
Well, yeah, and we'll hit on that with grace too, because that goes with the reflective nature that with Christ. Like once you really have it, but to really have it, what do you first need? You have to have.
Well, hold on though. When we're talking about like athletic grace, that's not God's grace, that's us.
Right, but what I'm saying is we identify it internally. I think the responses are similar. We know it. So in other words, there's only one way to hit the ball on the sweet spot of a bat. There's no other way for everyone, and it's unique for everyone. But there's only one way for everyone. But you know it every time you do it and every time you don't. And grace kind of operates the same way. You have almost the same internalized response where you identify it, you feel it, and it's this complete feeling. The moment it hits, you know it was the sweet spot. And I think yeah, and I think that we sometimes neglect the similarities with our internalized feeling and our abstract relationship dynamics versus the physical dynamics we can identify, but the same responses are happening. And that's what I mean with the sweet spot. The thing with grace is to have a sweet spot, you have to have a peak, something for the sweet spot. You have to have a beacon of sorts. You have to have that piece that is identifiable that, yes, this is what grace is. No one, like, in other words,
like an external test.
Well, yeah, like in other words, if you don't have a figure like Christ to say, this is grace, I am love, I am grace, this is it, do this as I do, walk this walk, then you don't actually have a sweet spot to try to swing the bat. You're just, there's nothing, there's no, and that's why.
Like you gotta have, you can't find the sweet spot if there isn't a real thing there.
Exactly.
It's not a matter. It's not just.
There's not like you can't throw a dart without a dartboard, right? You can throw it, but if there's no identifier for the bullseye, right? Then it's a useless. Yeah, it's just a use. So So Christ kind of provide, and that's why I'm going to get with I think grace is actually kind of a quantum force, because what grace ultimately is something that requires a something that stated it was outside of this world, brought into it, that is love, is grace, to identify and reflect. And when we think about reflection, that's light. All the light we see is reflection. So, photons, other than in water, of course, and that's also where we're baptized. But basically, the reflection is all we see. And then this grace reflection comes down and says, reflect what I do. So you have that component saying it's a force. But then here's the key part that I think it's a force.
Come on, gentlemen.
Yeah.
I'm letting you guys talk. Let me take over a second.
Yep.
This equation is widely considered by mathematicians to be the most perfect equation.
Oh, are you? I'm on your face. No pun intended. Right now.
Oh, yeah. I thought we switched over.
My bad.
What's I?
No, that's good.
What's I?
I is the imaginary number I, and as soon as I find this
What's
thing
E?
And share my screen, which is fine. Spencer's cute, so it's perfect. I've been taking notes all along here.
Perfect.
What's E then?
E is is actually known as Euler's number, and that's who this equation is also named after. It looks like Euler, but it's actually pronounced Euler. And
I'm gonna say Euler.
Well, you can go ahead and say Euler, but his name is Euler. The Swedish mathematician. He wrote like 70 books. 20 of them have actually been translated out of his original language. And this equation, among all the equations he made, is the only one that might really be called Euler's equation, because there's so many. And it's got all of the major numbers and all the major connections and nothing else. And it's absolutely true.
Yeah. Wow.
It's got I multiplied to pi. It's got E raised to I.
Oh my God.
It's added. And then it's got the major number from arithmetic, the major number from experience, the major number from geometry, the major number from both number theory and algebra, and the major number from calculus.
Wow.
And it's like this. It doesn't really do anything. You can mess with it and use it to derive stuff, but it's kind of like a mathematical version of grace, because. And I was keeping track of all these phrases as we went.
You have to have a failure to notice grace.
No, that's exactly the point. The sweet spot of a bat is when you get it right. Right?
No, like...
Look, I copied down all the words you guys use. The beautiful intersection between life and the universe, not just a mere opinion. When you see it, it's something you can receive, it's something you can give, it's something you can be. It's abstract, it's got a level of mystery, there's elegance. You mentioned perfection, so... I did? Yep, that was your word.
I was going to say, there has to be some sort of failure first to notice...
Well, I think I see what you're saying.
We're talking about what it takes to learn grace.
Yeah.
We're talking about the feeling of, when
you identify grace, when you hit the trick, with the grace is when you hit the trick, and so that's that perfection.
No.
Right, and I'm not going to unpack that equation, but the people who know those numbers, when they see it, it's like, oh, it's just like this thing. It's just like this little word for the universe. It's like the tightest thing the universe can say in math.
What I was going to say.
What is the tightest thing we've said in math? What were you going to say, son?
I said that, well, I used to watch videos from rail skateboarding of ollies, and it was cool, and I understood it. But then when I went to the skate park and I practiced a ton and I couldn't do it, and then I had my friend Steven do it, then I realized the trick. Then I realized how
then you can find
good it looked. So then they showed me how to do it correctly, and then I did it, and then I noticed that. But I wouldn't, even though I could have done it before and not noticed, I would have, it's like...
You're talking about the wilderness before grace.
Until you've experienced failures, you can't notice grace.
Yep, and so absolutely. So this is what I call the wilderness. So I have a phrase that says, and it's this: the only promised land we can find is the wilderness. And what I mean by that is the only thing you can find are your failures, and then you have to be granted the promised land, which is the truth, which is the conclusion of overcoming your failures. So you can, the only promised land you can find.
Sorry, I didn't get the phrase down.
The only promised land you can find is the wilderness. You have to be granted the actual promised land. So you can find your failures, but the truth will reveal itself. And let me say on the grace thing, I think this one's critical for real world application today. This is, I guess, would be my quote unquote thesis for why it's an actual force. When you have an environment you're around, a perspective environment, which is a critical thing to realize, that when you have multiple perspectives, it's like having different environments around you. You might have an over radiating star who's very angry about something. You might have a passive planet who's very isolated. You're going to have very different perspectives around you, and when those perspectives,
that's kind of like that's weird. That's kind of like the cultural environment, not like the physical environment.
Yeah, well, it's kind of that unseen environment that's going around, but it's important because based on previous perceptions of what happened, the internal response happening from everyone in that room is going to be different. And as that intensifies, that internal response is going to intensify based on previous experience. And therefore, what grace does in the moments of intensifying force off of previous experience that have gone in a negative way is it neutralizes this over-radiating reflective nature where people are getting more angry at one another, where people are getting almost violent toward one another. When it's like when that truly gracious person enters the room, that truly passive, not passive, but rebuking, but graceful and person comes in the room and grants grace, you actually see the room. Like when you say, I forgive you, if you're in a fight between two people and you say, you know what, I'm going to grant grace to myself. I messed up. And you know what? I'm sorry for that. And whatever you did, I don't care anymore. The entire environment of that room changes.
No, I tell you, I know exactly what you're talking about. It's a social force.
Yeah.
And you know, there's a lot of movies, a lot of TV shows where a lot of what's going on is the social awkwardness where that's completely missing. And at some level, you know, if you talk about like the story arc, it's like when you talk about a piece of music finishing up or a story finishing up well, it's kind of like completing something. It's kind of like finishing a structure. And I think that's a similar type of grace is what you're talking about.
Awkwardness.
That's what I'm saying.
Awkwardness,
the awkwardness
is the opposite of grace.
Yes, you heard me great.
I'm sorry.
That was the point, is that there's the going against grace is what makes for drama. Messing it up, like.
Yeah, so when you're
obviously we see this perfection, but it's also the struggle to get there, and the things that we blow and screw up that make.
Well, that's where you see a lot of entertainment, and I think you were getting to this. Kind of capitalize off of that. They create basically the structure of if we're going to go to like a dramedy type movie, there's about 60 to 80 minutes worth of really ungracious periods of time. And then there's about a 20-minute period of all of this resolution in a very graceful way. And then there's the conclusion, which is this very transformative component. And so that's where, yeah, exactly. Like you had said before, drama messes it up. Awkwardness, this is the opposite of grace. And really, pattern readers essentially, or Hollywood, capitalizes off of things like this every day.
The graceful transformation, that's like comedy, right?
Yeah.
And then tragedy would be when the grace of the universe forces itself on the bad guy.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how often you see movies where the bad guy, like the movie's not over till the bad guy gets some sort of awful, horrible death.
Yeah.
So let me describe what my mom said. It's not much different than what we've already covered. But what she told me ages and ages ago is that grace is this feeling you get from sometimes out of nowhere, usually when you're doing something else. It's just a sense you get that you're completely in touch with the universe on every level. And she described it in a way that I had experienced before. So let me describe it for you and see what you think, right?
Yep.
Have you ever been like falling asleep and you imagine like it's almost like a voice, but not quite. Like it's not your voice. Like your own thoughts are like your own voice, right? But this is like another voice, and they say like 3 or 4 syllables, and that just like sums up your like everything. It's just perfect.
Yep.
And then you go to try and like capture it, and it gets away, and you're like, what was that?
Absolutely.
Does that sound familiar?
Yes.
Not.
Don't tell me what it's not, please.
Never happened to me, but like.
I understand it hasn't happened because you're a little kid. I was only about your age when it first happened. The point is, there's actually a definite feeling that gets attached to this, or so my mom said, as if it's just a thing.
Something like that has happened.
Yeah, what happened?
Well, I said something, and then like suddenly had like a thought that like that doesn't quite sound like me, and then like something happened. I don't really understand.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a universe responding.
So
What?
David,
No.
Sorry.
David, you have an experience as well. Have you had? You know what I'm talking about? Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I go to rest, there's typically quite a few different summarizations like you just described that I then try to recapture.
Well, and that's the thing is that it's like it's always really short.
Yep.
And then you try and grasp it, and it just gets away from you.
I didn't think at the time. I didn't think it was the universe responding. I think it was me thinking of myself, my body, and such as separate. For a second, I was like, whoa.
You know, they say the ancient Greeks that they
Immediately, I was like, sorry.
I used to try to, and this might sound weird, but now that I've gotten older, I realize that this is a good way to try to actually perceive life. But even in high school, I tried to actually look at what I was doing, like try to picture myself outside of myself and just looking at what I was doing and how I would feel about that. And that actually kept me out of certain troubles. Just trying to visualize myself outside of myself, watching myself do those things I was doing. And that sounded similar to what you were describing there. But basically you're a part of the universe. So if you're doing that to yourself, then that is in a sense, the universe talking to you.
Well, but it's that same thing, like you said, that beautiful intersection, that sudden, that connection. And my mom said this was specifically God's grace because it came out of nowhere. When we talk about finding the sweet spot of a bat, that's you. That's just you doing it, right?
Yep.
This is this thing from out of nowhere. And when you talk about like a view of yourself from the outside, that can certainly just sort of come up out of nowhere too. The other thing she told me is that if you have that feeling, it means you've been picked.
Interesting.
And that you're going to be tested.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, that's right in line with everything that has to do with selection. I mean, forged in the fire, the furnace, the wilderness line I alluded to is obviously a call to Exodus, but basically, yeah. And really I would say regardless of your religious or non-religious or spiritual concepts, when you think about grace or anything like trying to perceive grace, you have to have, like you were talking about those with the time period where you're struggling on the skateboard, you have to have that period where you're just, beaten. I mean, and I don't mean beaten in the worst, but you have to get to a point where you recognize the mistakes you've made. That's kind of the only way to be able to identify what grace is, because the first part of grace is grace for yourself. The first way to learn the correct way to do the trick on the skateboard is to listen to the friend who suggests the better way. The only way you can listen to the friend, the only way you can listen to the friend is if you are gracious enough to allow yourself the room to make the mistake or be aware of a mistake may have been made. So the first thing you do is and this is why it's reflective. So I'm going to provide grace for myself. That's going to allow me to be gracious to others because I forgive myself for whatever I did. And so it goes back to that Samaritan line almost. But because I can be gracious for what I did, I can be gracious for whatever the heck they did. So.
Yeah, for sure. The reflection is critical to all sorts of things, especially the things that we associate with the best in ourselves.
And with the fighting game, I was really having trouble until I did this technique where I stopped after one game, right? And then I thought, what did I do wrong there? And I'm like, well, we kicked at too close of a range, right? And then so I played another game and I did great because I was moving back, sweep kicking, moving forward, knee kick, high kick, which worked for me for a while. And then the AI got smart and decided to.
The AI does get smart.
So I want to hit on that real quick because I know we're probably out of time here. But
we're about half an hour. We're coming up on half an hour.
Every time you move back and every time you move forward, that was either air or grace. Or no, that was either air or hopeful grace. But then the ability to find grace, that is that kind of intersectional, that one time you do it correctly. And so I wanted to hit on that little analogy he was doing there because there's a Bible verse that says, try everything and throw away what's bad. And the only way you can do that from a conscientious level is to have grace for yourself. To be able to try everything and throw away what's bad means it actually is the pursuit of trying the wrong things and throwing away what's bad.
And I don't think doing it correctly is enough to be graceful. I think you have to do it in a way that doesn't feel cheap.
Well, no, you have to earn it.
Like when I was dropping in on my board, the first
Jesus grants grace. Yeah.
I did it. Like I was sticking my front foot way down and my back foot way up, and it worked. I just looked terrible while doing it. But now I'm learning more and more to lean all the way into my drop. So it's becoming more graceful. It's becoming less of a cheap party trick that I don't look comfortable with. So
David, you know what romance is?
Romance?
Yeah. I want to finish up on this because it connects to what you just
said. I would say hit me with the equals because I have an idea, but it would be too abstract.
I do this all the time. I think of these goofy definitions. What? Yes. Yeah, Spencer's guessing. This is what I came up with when I was talking to him the other day, and I realized that most romantic comedies boil down to some dude looking stupid in front of a girl.
Yeah. Hitch. Yeah.
And you're talking about the same thing. The reason it's romantic is because they're trying different stuff.
Yeah.
They're willing to give themselves that space and become vulnerable.
Well, and it's actually all of the stupid things collectively that they're doing to try to find the right thing that become the right thing. That's the
best ones, right?
Yeah.
What's that one with Adam Sandler and Drew Barrymore?
50 First Dates.
Yeah, where every time he's got to start over and it's fine. It's
perfect. That's a great analogy. Yeah.
That's just the one that came up because you're missing the difference.
No, that's a great one.
So I think we should wrap it up here. I think we covered everything, right?
Yeah. Good unpack session. Spence, right on for the input. I think it was a great session.